Σας ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ που είστε εδώ. Έχουμε την πολύ μεγάλη χαρά και τιμή να φιλοξενούμε έναν σπουδαίο ιστορικό, τον Άντονι Πάγκντεν. Λοιπόν, θα σας διαβάσω ένα πολύ σύντομο βιογραφικό, γιατί ο κύριος Πάγκντεν έχει ετοιμάσει κάτι για το βιβλίο, το οποίο είναι πάρα πολύ μεγάλο και πάρα πολύ ενδιαφέρον, αλλά έχει κάνει αρκετούς ιστορικούς άξονες για να καταλάβετε και εσείς που δεν έχετε διαβάσει το βιβλίο, αλλά και εμείς τι ακριβώς διαπραγματεύεται. Και μπορούμε μετά να περάσουμε σε ερωτήσεις, γιατί είναι ένα πάρα πολύ επίκαιρο βιβλίο, ειδικά μετά τις ευρωεκλογές και τα αποτελέσματά της. Λοιπόν, ο Άντονι Πάγκντεν έχει εργαστεί ως μεταφραστής επιμελητής, είναι φυσικά η βασική ιδιότητα ιστορικός, σε ζητήματα ισπανικής και ευρωπαϊκής ιστορίας. Δίδαξε στα πανεπιστήμια του Κέμπριτζ, στο Οξφόρντ και στο Χάρβαρντ. Πρωτού είχε καθηγητή στο Τζον Χόπκινς και στο Πανεπιστήμιο της Καλιφόρνια στο Λος Άντζελες. Στα ελληνικά κυκλοφορεί το βιβλίο του «Κόσμοι σε πόλεμο» και αυτό εδώ το βιβλίο, η επιδίωξη της Ευρώπης, για το οποίο θα κάνουμε κουβέντα σήμερα. Δίνω αμέσως το λόγο, γιατί έχουμε ξεφύγει λίγο στον χρόνο, για να ξεκινήσει την εισήγησή μου.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay. Well, first of all, let me thank the organisers of this festival for their very kind and flattering invitation, and in particular to Zoe for having organised it also admirably, and a special thanks to Lena, of course, for having agreed to discuss this book of mine with me. Now, Europe said, so I'll start to give you a brief account of what I tried to set out to do in this book, and then we'll have a discussion. So Europe, said the Greek geographer Strabo in the 1st century of the Christian era, was unique in being able to provide for itself, I quote, all the fruits that are best and are necessary for life and all the useful metals. But, he said, only Europe as a continent could do this because life was so difficult for each individual people separately. They could only survive by cooperating, even if that cooperation was often sporadic and uncertain. One form this cooperation took was the League. And the greatest of them, the great Amphitryon League, supposedly founded after the Trojan War, but still in existence when Strabo himself was writing, became a model, or at least an inspiration, a point of reference for James Madison and James Wilson for the new United States, which was going to be a kind of new form of Amphitryon. And Napoleon, looking back from exile at all that he had achieved and lost, of course, declared somewhat disingenuously in 1816 that all he had tried to do was to make a world where it would be possible, I quote, to dream for the great European family, the application of the American Congress or the Amphitryons of Greece. Now, the idea of a single united Europe, which is really what the book is about, could be said to have begun in its modern form, because it has an ancient one as well, with that remark. For if the European Union, in which we, fortunately, you rather fortunately, all live today, has an origin not merely as a general conception of a communality of peoples and cultures, what Voltaire in the 18th century called the Great European Republic, but as a political project, it was there. It was actually with that remark. But it was not Napoleon who was responsible for initiating what would eventually become today's Europe. Rather, it was the attempt by his enemies, the so-called great powers of Austria, Britain, Russia, and Prussia, who in 1815 famously gathered together in the city of Vienna to rebuild Europe, or so they hoped, as an alliance between them. The Congress of Vienna, as this was called, or as it's sometimes called the Concert of Europe, or more tellingly so, the Areopagus of Europe, was responsible for what has come to be known as the Peace of Vienna. That, with the important exception of two wars, the Crimean War of 1853-56 and the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, lasted until 1914, so an entire century. One response to this effort of consolidation was the rise of nationalism, which, as Friedrich Nietzsche said of it, had been, I quote, nothing more than a reaction to Napoleon's efforts and would not exist without Napoleon. And subsequently the emergence of the modern nation state as we know it today. Now, hitherto there had been nations, but many of these were parts of larger states or of multicultural empires, such as Austrian, the Spanish, the Russian, the Ottoman. They may have had a sense, these peoples, these nations, of their own identity, their own culture. They usually had their own languages and often their own religions. But they did not have sole control of their own affairs or any political independence. They did not, in short, have states. Now, between 1830 and 1914, at least 14 new states came into existence in Europe, all in part or in whole the creation of this new nationalism. The most earliest one, of course, is Greece in 1830. And then we have Belgium, Romania, Italy between 1859 and 71, Germany, which was united into what became the Second German Reich in 1864 to 71, Bulgaria, Serbia, Norway, Albania, Finland, and in 1917, among others. By the outbreak of war in 1914, Europe had become, in effect, a system of nation-states, each of which now claimed an inalienable right, the right, as it came to be called, of self-determination, something which in 1948 became a human right, the new Bill of Human Rights on that date. Originally, the new nationalism had been responsible for this, which had been responsible for this extraordinary transformation, was, as it had been called, liberal. It was conceived, in the words of the great Italian revolutionary Giuseppe Mazzini, not as a separation of peoples, but what is he called a harmonization of them, and in particular of the peoples of Europe, into one great collective patria, homeland, which would be made up of smaller independent patriae. Today, wrote the French poet, playwright, novelist, and parliamentarian Victor Hugo in 1843, I quote, "There is in effect a European nationality, just as in the days of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides there was a Greek nationality. All the civilized nations of Europe," he went on, "despite the momentary antipathies, the jealousies of frontiers, are indissolubly linked by a secret and profound unity. Civilization has given to us all the same inner guts, entrailles, the same spirit, the same goal, and the same future." End of quote. "But for all that the nations of Europe share in common, each is also, at the same time, a member of an individual and distinct nation. France," Hugo concluded, "is our first nationality, as Athens was the first patria of Aeschylus and Sophocles. They were Athenians as we are French, and we are Europeans as they were Greeks." Now, all of this began to unravel with the coming of the First World War. Then, despite the heroic but ultimately doomed attempts of the post-war League of Nations to unite the peoples of the entire globe, with the rise of fascism and Nazism, which transformed the old liberal nationalism into a form of ferocious particularism, and finally, with the coming of the second and most recent World War, the European Union was, of course, born. And it was born, this union, as an attempt to undo, if you will, the damage, in the first instance anyway, of what the great British economist Maynard Keynes, who is in many ways responsible for the post-war economic order, described appropriately as the Great European Civil War, which in effect lasted from 1914 to 1945. But also, I have tried to argue, it was the outcome of a far longer and far deeper vision. There are, however, and there remain, embedded in the very idea of the nation-state itself, a serious obstacle to this enlightened cosmopolitan ideal, this liberal nationalism, as Mancini understood it. And that is the disquieting concept of sovereignty, the claim that the law can only be made for and by the peoples of the state for which they are citizens, that no state can have any claim, legal or moral, upon one another, and so on. Federalism, of which the European Union is, of course, an example, of any kind, by contrast, requires sharing, dividing sovereignty. And the one thing that in the eyes of most of its advocates sovereignty cannot be is precisely divided or shared. This dogma of absolute sovereignty, as one of the founders of the EU, Altiero Spinelli, called it, encourages states to recoil within themselves, isolating themselves. This was very neatly put by Vladimir Putin in June of 2020, despite the fact that he rules a state which is nominally at least a federation. He said, "There is no in-between, no immediate state. Either a country is sovereign or it is a colony, no matter what the colonies are called." Now, it was this obsession with sovereignty that gave us Brexit. which was sold as a move to defend Britain's sovereignty from all those terrible foreigners living in Brussels. And at its heart lies the ideological objectives, of course, of the populist parties of Europe on both the right and the left. The cry is always the same. Europe is robbing us of our national sovereignty. Our laws are now made in Brussels or Strasbourg, not in Berlin or Paris or Athens. True, the EU, unlike any former attempt to unite Europe, unlike the Concert of Europe, the Vienna Congress that is, or the League of Nations, is based upon a shared system of law. It has a common court, the European Court of Justice, and of course it has a parliament, which is becoming increasingly powerful and increasingly independent of the states of which it is composed. But contrary to what the peoples of Britain were constantly told in 2016, during the campaign for Brexit, the EU is governed by a principle known as subsidiarity, which, roughly speaking, is more complicated than this. What it means is that EU law only applies to those matters which concern the relationships between the member states, not within them. It does not govern the internal affairs of states. It is not true, as one hysterical Brexiteer told the press in 2016, I quote, "Brussels can decide to abolish Christmas if they wish to, and nothing can stop them." There is, of course, the European Court of Human Rights, but as that's a part of the Council of Europe, which has juridical powers well beyond the frontiers of the EU, even that cannot abolish Christmas. The EU is the beginning of the fulfillment of a project, which, as I have argued in the book, the Europeans, or at least the most enlightened, reflected and far-seeing of them, have been struggling towards since antiquity. I need hardly say, however, of course, that it is very far from complete. But then completion is not really the issue. Europe today is a never-ending project. In April of this year, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, aptly described Europe as, I quote, "a never-ending conversation." The slogan, "Ever Closer Union," captures this nicely. Ever closer, but never total. It could be said today that Europe is what at the end of the 18th century, Immanuel Kant, great Prussian philosopher, who had envisaged something similar for the entire world, what he called a Weltrepublik, called a construction of reason, by which he meant a realistic, if not realizable ideal that we should always keep in mind even if we never actually get there. Not for nothing, as again, the motto of the EU, a seeming oxymoron, unity in diversity. The EU, of course, still has a long way to go. All states have a long way to go. But it has created the first multinational confederation, the first union of national states, for all that the populists of left and right have tried to undermine it in the history of the continent, in the history perhaps of any continent. Let me end, therefore, briefly, having made these statements, with the future, or at least one possible future. Most of the problems that individual states face today cannot be resolved individually. This is most obviously true of two of them, the potentially most devastating, namely climate change and immigration. The first is obvious enough. Climate is no respecter of frontiers, and the EU has done more to limit the potentially devastating effect of modern technologies than any other community on Earth, and ancient technologies, should be said as well, with the possible exception of the state of California. Immigration is again something which all European frontline states, Greece perhaps more than any other, know only too well cannot be resolved by one state acting on its own. For although it has reduced, the flows of immigrants has been reduced substantially in the very recent past, what we are surely witnessing in the long term is not really immigration, but, as the great Italian novelist Umberto Eco said a good many years ago now, a migration, likes of which Europe has not experienced as the Germanic tribes swept into and eventually destroyed the Roman Empire in the 6th century. I have tried to argue that unless we are prepared to turn our backs on one of the most sacred of European, originally Greek values, namely the right of hospitality and the duty towards refugees, then we will have to find ways to accommodate these new settlers in our midst. But again, we cannot do it by ourselves. But I believe that they, or more probably their children and their children's children, are far more likely to find Europe as a more congenial and more liberating place in which to identify themselves than, say, Italy or France or Spain. In this book, then, I've tried to describe how and why the EU came into existence as the very remarkable human experiment that it is. How it is, in effect, the latest stage in a project which has been slowly evolving over centuries. It is, of course, still evolving, but it offers, I suggest, a model for the future, precisely as a construct of reason, not only for Europe, but in the world beyond. Thank you.
Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ, Άντονι, για αυτή την εισαγωγή. Νομίζω ότι ήταν πάρα πολύ κατατοπιστική και πολύ χρήσιμοι ιστορικοί άξονες που μας έδωσε για να ξεκινήσουμε την κουβέντα, αν και δεν έχουμε πάρα πολύ χρόνο. Είχα ετοιμάσει κάποιες ερωτήσεις, αλλά μάλλον θα ξεκινήσω από το τέλος. Μέσα στην εισήγηση έγραψε...
So this is a good place to start from.
Okay.
Yes.
Ότι η Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση είναι μια συνεχής διαδικασία, η οποία εξελίσσεται ακόμη. Δηλαδή, ένα αγνώστο ταυτότητας πολιτικό αντικείμενο, χωρίς στόχο. Έχει κάποιο στόχο ή θα είναι πάντα μια διαδικασία η Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση?
I think it's a difficult question to approach, because I can't think of any political organization which is not a project. I mean, that's to say that if you think, there's a tendency to talk about the EU as though there was some kind of form in which it could take at the end of the day, which would be fixed in time. But no state has been fixed in time. Even the United States, which is the longest lasting state on the planet, without a major reform operation, a major change in its constitutional form, even that internally has changed massively in the last 100 years. And I cannot envisage a future for Europe that isn't continually evolving. I think there are large numbers of problems that need to be worked out, obviously. But then I can think of no state on the planet which doesn't have a large number of problems that needs to have worked out. So I think there's a constant tendency to talk about the EU, which has a lot to do with the way it was conceived as a series of treaties and as essentially a legal order with a sort of thin layer of national identities plastered over the top of it, a flag and a national anthem, a day, and so on and so forth, as being something that has a completed objective, that one day we're going to wake up and find ourselves in an EU which is perfect, and then it will never change after that. I just don't think that's likely. That's not likely to happen. It's not even desirable, because if it were to happen, you would run into exactly the same problems that the United Nations keeps running into at levels with trying to modify its outdated constitution to fit the first half of the 21st century.
Σε μια διαφορετική ιστορική συνθήκη, ο Βικτόρ Γκό είχε θέσει ένα δίλημμα, αν η Ευρώπη θα γίνει Γαλλία ή Γερμανία. Μετά τις προεκλογές, αυτό το δίλημμα παραμένει ή έχει καταλήξει κάπου?
Yes, I think, don't forget, Victor Hugo was writing at a very crucial time, and the passage I quoted from came before the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, in which Paris was invaded. Of course, it's precisely, in Versailles the Reich was just outside Versailles. The Second Reich, the unified Germany was conceived, so it was given its identity. So it's, and he in particular had this very clear idea that, interestingly enough, that Europe was composed of two things: reason and passion. And the Germans represented passion, and the French represented reason. We might think the reverse is true today, but I think there's a notion that, and of course it's true that if you think about it, that these two nations, the largest, most powerful economically and political nations at the heart of Europe, have been in sort of collaboration and conflict with one another since that day, and so of course during the First and Second World Wars. But there's none of that conflict now. They don't agree on many issues as such, but I don't see any real falling out between them. A lot of Brexit, of course, one of the things of Brexit was that the English had joined, the British side had joined the EU as a customs union, that's all they wanted to be a part of, and they did their very best not to have anything to do with anything that was other than that. And they felt, of course, the British always felt that this was being dominated by these two mega powers. And of course, if you look at it from the perspective of Greece or Portugal or Spain or even Italy, then it does look at these two powers at the centre of it. And the idea that there should be another war in which these two would come together, as the British kept on suggesting, and somehow eradicate all the others, turn the EU into a mega state, in which all of the powers of all the European states would become dominated by these two in some coalition with each other, seems to me a fantasy. I think that it's inevitably the case in any kind of federation of this sort. The balance between the various parts, maintaining the balance between the various parts, is extremely difficult. And again, if you look at what happens in the United States, which is in fact I'm not using this as a model, although it was often used as a model in the 19th and in fact in the early 20th century for what Europe might become. But you have the same problem, and it can between very, very powerful states such as California and very, very weak states. And there are ways in which this can be overcome, and it's a constant juggling. It requires, I think, it certainly requires a much stronger federal government than probably exists at the moment in the EU. But therein, however, lies a problem.